We're going to start out with a little light reading from the New York Times. This was an op-ed that I'm honestly surprised didn't go viral because I thought it was quite something to behold, especially for people in this space. It's an op-ed by David Brooks. David Brooks, the ultimate square, David Brooks. What if we're the bad guys here? Now, he's a little bit vague in terms of what he's talking about here, but you can see from the opening kind of what he means. Donald Trump seems to get indicted on a weekly basis, yet he is utterly dominating his Republican rivals in the polls, and he is tied with Joe Biden in the general election surveys. Trump's poll numbers are stronger against Biden now than at any time in 2020. What's going on here? Why is this guy politically viable after all he's done? We anti-Trumpers often tell a story to explain that. It was encapsulated in a quote the University of North Carolina political scientist Mark Hetherington gave to my colleague Thomas B. Edsall recently. That would be a good paragraph for the FOP voice, right? Yeah. Republicans see a world changing around them uncomfortably fast, and they want it to slow down, maybe even take a step backward. But if you are a person of color, a woman who values gender equality, or an LGBT person, would you want to go back to 1963? I doubt it. So now he gets into what he means. In this story, we anti-Trumpers are the good guys, the forces of progress and enlightenment. The Trumpers are reactionary bigots and authoritarians. Many Republicans support Trump no matter what, according to this story, because at the end of the day, he's still the bigot in chief, the embodiment of their resentments, and that's what matters to them most. I partly agree with this story, but it's also a monument to elite self-satisfaction. So let me try another story on you. I ask you to try on a vantage point in which we anti-Trumpers are not the eternal good guys. In fact, we're the bad guys. So then he goes and he red pills the readers. This story begins in the 1960s when high school grads had to go off to fight in Vietnam, but the children of the educated class got college deferments. It's the whole fortunate son, right? It continues in the 1970s when the authorities imposed busing on working class areas in Boston, but not on the upscale communities like Wellesley, where they themselves lived. Now here he gets into some stuff.
That was very much like the Martha's Vineyard migrant caper.
Exactly.
That has to be one of the greatest. If Michael Moore still had the fucking balls, like that shot of them waving off the migrants going to the army base with, bye, and sending them off with their little juice boxes and, boxes of Kellogg's cornflakes. That is something that would show up in a classic Michael Moore movie about the hypocrisy of the liberal class. I don't think he has the balls to make that movie anymore. I think he's got too much Trump derangement syndrome to make.
I think that's probably right. But that is a good example. That's definitely a good example. We're not going to read this whole thing, but I will read a couple more key sections here. The ideal that we're all in this together was replaced with the reality that the educated class lives in a world up here and everyone else is forced into a world down there. Don't forget, this is David Brooks writing this, right? Members of our class are always publicly speaking out for the marginalized, but somehow we always end up building systems, yes, that serve ourselves. The most important of these systems is the modern meritocracy. We build an entire social
sounds like Thomas
order.
Frank.
Exactly. Yeah, he does. He says, we built an entire social order that sorts and excludes people on the basis of the quality that we possessed most, academic achievement. Then he goes on, the meritocracy isn't only a system of exclusion, it's an ethos. During his presidency, Barack Obama used the word smart in the context of his policies over 900 times. The implication was that anybody who disagreed with his policies and perhaps didn't go to Harvard Law must be stupid. He then goes on to talk about how entire professions have been filtered up to the elite and elite adjacent sort of sectors, including his own journalism, right? He does write a great deal about that. But I want to skip down here to some really great stuff. Like all elites, we talk about this all the time. Maybe David Brooks is a fan of the show. I don't know.
Surprise me.
Maybe Cyrus is actually David Brooks. Is Cyrus here tonight? Are you David Brooks, Cyrus? Is that where you get all that super chat money from? Are you one of these elites? Yeah. So here he goes. Like all elites, we use language and mores as tools to recognize one another and exclude others. Using words like problematic, cisgender, Latinx, and intersectional is a sure sign that you've got cultural capital coming out of your ears. That's what we say all the time. Yep. Meanwhile, members of the less educated classes have to walk on eggshells because they never know when we've changed the usage rules so that something that was sayable 5 years ago now gets you fired.
Or if you crack your knuckles on camera or something and they decide it's a white
supremacist symbol
even though you're Latino.
I've actually
That's a true story that happened to an electrical worker.
I've edited out portions of monologues that I've done based on hand signals that I'm like, oh, is that too close to the thing where you put your arm, you put your pointer and your thumb together? Yeah, exactly. But here, this is where it gets
okay.
Right, yeah, exactly. If you say so. So that last part was what Russell says all the time about how a lot of this woke signaling is class signaling. You're just signaling to someone else that you know the lingo, that you're in the club. It's not grounded in any sense of empathy or any sort of longing for a more just world. It's pure class and cultural signaling. So he echoes
that's why you can tell them all day, and I've had this experience. You could tell them, hey, you know, Latin people don't actually like Latinx. They've done multiple polls on this. Yes, they do.
Yes, they do. The ones we talk to, the rich ones, right? The rich
that's literally the response I've gotten. No, right. Yes, they do. Right? Because AOC says it, right?
Right. Exactly. All right. So that piece really echoed a lot of what Russell says. Now I got to read the piece that echoes what I've said multiple times on this show. It was very, very gratifying to hear it from David Brooks, gratifying and vindicating at the same time. So he says, does this mean that I think the people in my class are vicious and evil? No. Most of us are earnest, kind, and public-spirited. Yeah, so you think. But we take for granted...
That's how they see themselves. Yeah.
Right, exactly. That's how they see themselves. But we take for granted and benefit from systems that have become oppressive. Now, this is what I say all the time. Elite institutions have become so politically progressive in part because the people in them want to feel good about themselves as they take part in systems that exclude and reject. That is almost word for word what I say. What do you learn at college? I say it all the time. You don't learn to change the system. You learn to process your guilt about benefiting from the system. That's what all the progressive indoctrination at universities is about. It's not about working towards correcting systemic failures. It's about bearing witness to systemic failures so that you can manage your own guilt about the fact that you are going through this institution in order to become a beneficiary of an unjust system.
Well, this is an old trick of the rich, maybe the oldest trick of the rich. There's clearly a certain level of psychological dissonance that comes with being rich and looking at people who are poor. And if you assume, as I do, that being a social animal, empathy is probably programmed into the species, along with other darker qualities. I mean, chimps make war. I'm not saying it's all cherries and rainbows, but there's definitely a genetic disposition in a social species, particularly an advanced primate, towards empathy. So you have to square that circle for yourself. How do you live with being rich? And the most common tactic over time has been to cast the poor as morally flawed, to justify it to yourself by considering them uncultured, uncivilized, barbaric, ultimately some variation of immoral. Now, with the loss of religious faith, they were at a loss for how to brand people immoral, right? Wokeness gave them a new religious frame by which to define people who don't have their privileges as immoral.
Exactly. That's exactly right. He goes on. We won't read the whole rest of it. It gets a little bit labored there, but he finishes here. As the sociologist E. Digby Baltzell wrote years ago, history is a graveyard of classes which have preferred caste privileges to leadership. That is the destiny our class is now flirting with. We can condemn the Trumpian populists until the cows come home, but the real question is, when will we stop behaving in ways that make Trumpism inevitable? Well, this is where I can answer that question for you, David Brooks. This was the answer that the Bernie people had in 2016, right? Like, the answer to that question is you need something more than liberal capitalism. You need something more than that. As long as your answer to populism, right-wing populism, is just neoliberalism, capitalism that is sort of masked over with woke language, then that is no answer to Trumpian populism. It's no match for it. And so, it's kind of amazing reading that 7 years after, we were saying the exact same things, more or less, based on the exact same revelations about the system. Obviously, we're left-wing, and Brooks is obviously much more right-wing. But it's kind of interesting that he would frame it that way. Like, are we the bad guys here? Okay, well, if you think you're the bad guys now, but you're not a socialist, then it sounds like you are kind of ceding some moral high ground to those right-wing Trumpian populists, right? Like, what other solution are you offering? He had a class analysis there. I don't see David Brooks switching parties anytime soon, or not even switching parties, but I don't see him, joining the Greens anytime soon. So what does he want? What does he think is going to happen? What is his prescription?
If anyone was going to write this article, it would be David Brooks. He has a long history of self-flagellating his PMC privileges. He wrote this article, I never forgot, after George Bush got elected, really pandering to his voting base and excoriating himself. It was very much to the effect, I may be an off-putting, sweaty, sock suspender wearing guy, and you know what? Because of that, I don't know what soybeans look like growing in the field the way that a Bush voter does. He literally said that. I don't know what soybeans. So what do I know about the politics of the country? What do I really know? Because people like me never saw George Bush coming. So he's always flirted with that, while at the same time being one of the most shameless hacks in Washington. This article was so infamous when I brought it up, you actually remembered it. George Bush basically proposed his glorified legal secretary for the Supreme Court, a woman named Harriet Miers, who in no way, shape, or form, even from a conservative perspective, was qualified to serve on that court. She made Clarence Thomas look like Clarence Darrow. Okay, like, she was absurd. So it was very obvious that they called on David Brooks as a friendly reporter to write a nice article arguing for her nomination. And she was so lacking in qualities to recommend her that he had to fall back on talking about grammar and punctuation. I shit you not. He talked about how, well, when you see legal decisions that are precise, that are, he was basically getting into the syntax will be good if you nominate Myers. Like, he couldn't say anything about her legal thinking, her legal reasoning. It was basically the qualities that he suggested should put her on the Supreme Court were secretarial qualities. She'll keep everything very neat, very organized. If you put her on the court, that was the best he could do. And at the end, he has this. He actually closed it out with, and then you will know it is the Myers court. Wow, man! Like, he must have had to take a shower after he wrote that. Like, I can't believe gobbling George Bush's knob that deep. But he did it. So if there was anyone who was gonna write this very conflicted piece, what if we're the bad guys? It would have been David Brooks.
Well, it's funny because, like, that vision of the, like, salt of the earth, simple,
Right.
just Midwestern every man and every woman,
Right.
as the Bush voter back then, that was a much more benign version of that voter than what ended up incarnating in the Trump movement.
Sure.
Right? When George Bush was running, it's, these are just a bunch of like monogamous, God-fearing farmers, right? Who were offended by the president getting a blowjob in the Oval Office. That was the Bush movement, right? That sort of swept him in. The Trump movement was when those same people got very, very angry. And they showed a side of themselves that these guys weren't used to. So it was a little bit harder to sort of put themselves in their shoes. I'm talking about the David Brooks types. But it seems like they've come around to doing that in a way that just really, really struck me. I mean, he made points that we've been making on the show over and over again.
I'll say this. If they ever all get marched to the guillotine, David Brooks will be the one in line saying, we should have seen this coming.
Yeah, we should have seen this coming.
Brought this on ourselves.
Yeah.
I'll give him that.
Please clap.